So this is just a quick video to show you how I might go about creating a quotation explosion to help me analyze specific areas of language and help me to learn, memorize and recall the specific things that I need to talk about when focusing on a language and the effect of language in any literature text. So here's the quotation that I'm going to look at as an example, and I'm going to talk you through some of the notes that I might make. And I want to start off first of all by not looking at this quotation in isolation, but actually figuring out whereabouts in the play it appears. And we're talking about the dramatic context here. So where does it appear? It's Act 1, Scene 1. Who's speaking? It's the witches. And what is it that they're actually doing as well? As the fact that the audience are introduced to the witches for the first time here and that they are the first characters in the play that we come across shows how they are significant, but also understanding what it is that they're actually doing, i.e. they're casting a spell, actually gives us some indication as to maybe why this scene is quite important in terms of establishing the role of these characters and who these characters are. So immediately looking at this quotation, I can identify a device that has been used by Shakespeare, and that is of a paradox. So now that I've identified the device, I need to go a little bit further and actually start thinking about why they've used that device, or why Shakespeare has crafted them to be speaking in this way. And of course, he wants this paradoxical language to show that they're quite confusing. Links quite nicely to the idea of perception. I would avoid with this particular quotation trying to actually explain what the quotation means, because by the very nature of it being a paradox shows that it's quite confusing, so it's quite difficult to explain, but it fits perfectly with the theme of appearance versus reality, and that's the purpose behind using this paradoxical language. But also there I'm talking on a higher level because I understand the theme of the entire play. I'm showing a wider understanding of the play just by how I approach this language. So here I'm starting to actually look at another device that I've noticed. And again, I might not be talking about this in any great depth, but I'm just exploring at the moment. And I noticed that there's been alliteration of the F sound in that first line, fair is foul and foul is fair. So maybe there's some mileage in this to explore it a little bit further. So it adds to the rhythm. And as we're talking about rhythm with witches, as we may well have done at other points, it appears to demonstrate that it's like a spell. We could also pick out as part of this rhythm this trochaic tetrameter, and that trochaic tetrameter is actually different to much of the iambic pentameter and prose that the other characters are speaking throughout the rest of the play. Differentiates them, it sets them apart, shows that they're unusual, that they're unnatural. I'm also starting to look a little bit at specific words. So I want to draw on this idea of fog and think about what the connotations of fog are. Well, fog is unclear, it obscures your vision, it obscures your view. It makes things more ambiguous, and that fits in with this idea that the witches are trying to obscure your view, obscure your perception, and the use of equivocation throughout, hiding the truth, avoiding the truth where possible, shows that they're perhaps deliberately misleading characters, that they may indeed trick Macbeth and the characters that they encounter. Very much fitting with the stereotype of witchcraft in Jacobean era. And I want to continue focusing on the language because there's another word that's jumped out at me, and that's this particular adjective, filthy. And I think that's a particularly powerful adjective to use, and sort of fills us with disgust of what the witches are actually talking about. Even though at this point we don't know what they're actually talking about. But this foul thing isn't just foul, it's disgusting. And it also reinforces the Jacobean stereotype of witches in that they are ugly and an abomination. So once we start to explore these connotations of the words filthy and how it might apply to the witches, we can start to understand why this word has been used and start to explore the effect a little bit more, as if it's like a warning. Beware these characters, beware these abominations. But then finally I want to just draw on the historical context. What was happening at the time that influenced why the writer wrote this piece of work, why this writer used this language. So first of all, we can draw on James I, that Shakespeare was writing to appease James I because of his fascination, his obsession almost with witchcraft. But it also clearly identifies what have been referred to previously as the Weird Sisters, as witches that they are, through the use of the rhythm, the alliteration, the ambiguous, equivocal language, the disgusting word choices that have been used, the paradoxical nature. And that all fits in with this idea of contextual. What we understand about witches is that they are not to be trusted. They are instruments of darkness, and they will lead us on in our confusion. But it's also important to point out that there are alternative interpretations. You might have your own perfectly valid, reasonable alternative interpretations. So it's really important here with something like this to think, what do you think? Are there any other words that you would pick out? Would you explore fog or filthy in a different way? Does it mean something different to you that would actually make sense in the wider context of what we're talking about in the play? And if that's the case, I'd be starting to develop this quotation explosion even further by building on existing ideas or building in some alternative interpretations. And that would certainly push you higher up with higher grades, that you're showing that perhaps there is an alternative meaning. There are different ways that we can interpret this language presented to us by Shakespeare. So let's just press pause here and think about the process that we've actually gone through in order to explode that quotation. We began by looking at the dramatic context, identifying whereabouts in the text this particular quotation appears, who's speaking, what's happening, what are they talking about perhaps. We moved on to identifying some devices, mainly paradox and fair is foul and foul is fair, the alliteration that had been used, but also the rhythm, the rhyme, the tetrameter. So whilst this isn't a device spotting exercise where there are devices that have been used, it's useful in the quotation explosion to identify them in case you choose to talk about them later, in case it's relevant for you to talk about. We then began looking at key vocabulary choices, really zooming in on specific words, or it could be phrases. We just looked at words when we looked at the noun fog and we looked at the adjective filthy, and started to explore the connotations of those words, what we think about when we think of fog, what we think about when we think of the word filthy. And finally, we considered the ideas that we had based on the historical context. How does this quotation fit into our understanding of what was happening at that point that the text was written? And in particular, we looked at stereotypes of witches and how it would be used to appease James I and James I's fascination with witchcraft. But it's also important to remember that where possible, we need to be looking for alternative interpretations. That doesn't mean that you need to forcefully find that it could mean something else, but wherever there are options available to us to there being a dual meaning with any of the language or any of the quotations, then it's really prudent for us to explore that, if only in the quotation explosion, just so that we can get a full understanding of the words and how they've been used. And developing your own ideas too, not always being afraid to be thinking, well, this is what I've read on the internet, this is what this person said about it, but actually use your own discernment and figure out what could it mean in your own understanding, what it means to you. So if you want to get really smart, develop your learning further, practice these skills that you've just been learning about now, why don't you try doing your own quotation explosion and use it to write a paragraph of analysis? Or better still, get somebody in your study group to give you some critique on the quotation explosion or analysis paragraph that you've written and give you some feedback. And remember, be kind, be specific, and be helpful so that you can help each other progress. Thanks for listening.